Greetings, dear viewers. Today I want to have a short discussion on the Thermian argument. A close friend of mine has recently shown me the folding ideas video of the Thermian argument, and I find it to be just a little bit problematic. While I believe I initially failed to understand the point several times, after rewatching many times to try and truly understand the discussion that is trying to be held, I at least think I've finally understood. And I find this ultimately to be a pointless discussion, because in the example given in the video, it's very clear to me that two different discussions are taking place. One person is only concerned about the real-world implications of a work of fiction, while the other person is only concerned about justifying events taking place in said work of fiction using the diegetic reasons. And this, first of all, needs to be acknowledged. That being said, this discussion is not to take away from a person concerned about real-world implications from a work, but I strongly feel as if a better discussion can be taking place. I'd like to illustrate firstly that Dan Olson is an Alberta-based documentarian making videos on a broad range of subjects rooted in stories and how they reflect and shape the world around us. This is his Patreon description, so I understand the focus on wanting to discuss only the real-world impact. However, the discussion as he has it fails to acknowledge and assumes several things. One of them is intent. While I agree that yes, a fictional world isn't real and are indeed eternally mutable by their creators, what gives any person the right to dictate how an artist portrays their world? And this applies to art as a visual medium, music, movies, and video games. Because you found it to be distasteful? Oh, because it's corrupting the minds of the viewer and causing real-world issues. And while this may be true for the most impressionable of consumers, I believe it to be farcical for any reasonable person to be completely swayed by a single piece of media. And if a person is consistently consuming only sexist or racist material that has the actual verifiable intent of being sexist or racist, verifiable being absolutely critical here, there is a far more important discussion to be had about that. My problem with part of the discussion being had is the refusal to isolate intent. And as a layman, I see the Thermian argument closer to censorship than a reasonable discussion. Rather than try to understand what kind of person you are dealing with in this particular discussion, which in my opinion is actually the core problem not being talked about here, the intent is automatically assumed to be bad, which is not to say that it never is, but usually the intention is just to write a specific story catering to a specific audience or demographic. If you are not the intended audience, that's okay. If you were offended by a piece of work, my condolences. That's not a fun thing to have happen. However, to then only have a non-diegetic discussion focusing on the real-world impact is ultimately pointless unless your intention is to outright ban said material or censor it to the point of not including the offending elements, which in my opinion is unacceptable considering that education is not even part of the discussion either. To clarify my point, I will use a quote from the video. Quote, "You cannot criticize the world because that's just the way the world is. This is a deeply flawed argument because once again, fictional worlds aren't real and are eternally mutable by their creators. None of it actually exists, and the only part that does exist is the finished text and the idea it represents." End quote. My problem with that is, you can interpret an idea however you'd like to, and I can't stop you, but you don't get to decide what an idea represents. I don't care who you are. The only person on this whole planet that gets to decide what an idea represents is the artist creating such an idea. Similar concepts can imply and represent vastly different things, and the refusal to acknowledge that, well, it goes back to my point of two different discussions taking place. One person is, and the other person is not concerned about quote-unquote real-world consequences, which again is ultimately the type of person you are dealing with and not a problem with a piece of media. The other large assumption being made is responsibility. Whose responsibility is it to shape society? A single author? A dedicated team of game developers? The whole retinue of writers, actors, and other staff members pertaining to our particular film? Well, the correct answer is technically all of them. And the viewer, you share this responsibility. but the problem with society today is that not enough people care. Racism and sexism are running rampant, and we are the furthest into the future we've ever been. And it's not a specific individual's fault. It's not the politician or government's fault, but instead it's the authors and game designers' fault, which is absolutely ridiculous and not the point. An individual is responsible for their own thoughts and actions, and I can think of 5 more important discussions that need to take place around that basis, rather than try to attack a piece of media for being pornographically violent, racist, or sexist. And the intent behind creating media is not truly discussed because you need to sit down and have many discussions with the creator or creators to verify actual intent. Again, this is not to say there is not media that doesn't have the intention of being racist, sexist, or violent, but quote, the Thermian argument therefore serves only to shut down discussion because criticism of a creative work is ultimately criticism of the decisions that people made when they were putting it together, end quote, is absolutely clown world material. Criticism of a creative work and criticism of the decisions that people made when they were putting it together are 2 completely different discussions, and they must be held separately. That being said, the Thermian argument therefore serves only to shut down discussion is not an incorrect statement. However, Dan Olson coined this term himself, and the thing he fails to realize is that a lot of people are not capable of distinguishing between the 2 arguments. So the fact his discussion even takes place is a bit problematic, because needing to define the Thermian argument in the first place goes to illustrate the greater problem here, being the disconnect between said arguments in the first place. Verifiably, this video is not made to attack anyone. I just feel very strongly about the Thermian argument being flawed at its core. I can easily see types of people completely discounting several extremely valid opinions on a matter when simply 2 different discussions are being held here, and neither individual has the brains to realize that. On top of that, I don't owe you a non-diegetic explanation for anything, and trying to relate fantasy consistently to a purely non-diegetic format without verification of intent is in essence looking for a problem that didn't exist. And if the intention of the discussion was benevolent, like any discussion like this should be, one would come to the conclusion that it's a very multifaceted issue and we are focusing entirely on the wrong things here. That being said, Dan Olson is a pretty cool dude. He's got a lot of subscribers on YouTube, and he's got a pretty decent amount of Patreon donators, so he's making some decent dosh. He has a very large variety of content focusing on many topics, so go check him out. I'll leave a link in the description, and I hope you can find something that you like from him. Genuinely, I'm not shit talking, I'm being genuine here. The main purpose of this video is to just illustrate a different perspective on the matter, and hopefully I can instill some critical thinking into some people. Thank you for your time, I appreciate you for watching my video, and I sincerely hope we can all learn compassion and understanding of our fellow creatures we share this beautiful world with.
Congratulations.